And the psalm we're looking at tonight is to help us keep telling people that the God of the Bible is the only one who is really there, even when they don't like hearing that. Let me lead us in prayer before we look at the Bible together. Father, thank you for inspiring our Old Testament brother who wrote Psalm 48. And we pray that your Spirit would help us to share his response to you in our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Please do have a seat. Some of you have heard this story before, but I was at a party a while ago and someone asked me, what do you do? And I said, I work for a church. And so he said, are you some kind of counselor, which is how they try and cope with you? And so I said, as I often say, no, my job is to tell people about Jesus. And quick as a flash, he said to me, but you're not saying that Muslims and Buddhists and all the rest are all wrong, are you? And I knew what answer he wanted. He wanted me to say, no, I'm not saying anything like that. What I actually said was, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. They're all wrong. And he couldn't get away from me quickly enough. How to be dropped at a party, ploy number one. Because in our culture, people want you to affirm pretty much every belief. And if you don't, they can get offended. And the psalm we're looking at tonight is to help us keep telling people that the God of the Bible is the only one who is really there, even when they don't like hearing that. We may have a struggle saying it. So would you turn back in the Bibles to page 472, page 472, Psalm 48. There is a story behind the silhouette on my PowerPoint, and we'll get to that at the end. Page 472, Psalm 48. And the heading in capital letters, which is part of the inspired text of the Bible, says this: a psalm of the sons of Korah. So let me help you get your bearings. Up on the screen is a timeline with us in 2017. Go back 2,000 years and you get to Jesus and his life and death and resurrection. Dying on the cross for our forgiveness, rising again to show that he is the rightful king of everyone. That's what the New Testament part of the Bible is about. Go back 1,000 years before Jesus and you get to David. And God made him king of his people Israel, both to lead them then and to be a kind of model pointing forward to the kind of king Jesus would one day be. And that's in the Old Testament part of the Bible, which is where we meet these characters, the sons of Korah, because they were singer-songwriters, a bit like Andy Gorn, whom David put in charge to lead the praise and prayer at the tabernacle. And if you're thinking the what, take a look at the next picture. There is Jerusalem, the capital city of God's Old Testament people Israel. It's on a hill called Mount Zion. So in the Bible, Jerusalem is sometimes called Zion. Same place. And in Jerusalem, 1,000 years before Jesus, you'd have found two important things. The second most important was the king. So there's the white crown with the D in it, King David. The most important thing in the city was the tabernacle. That's the yellow triangle with the T in it. And the tabernacle was this symbolic tent where God made himself present with his people, which is the next picture, where the yellow crown at the top stands for the Lord and the dotted line for the way he made himself present through that tabernacle. Now, he did not want them to think he was in the tabernacle as if it contained him, as if they had God in a box, as if he wasn't present everywhere. But he promised through that tabernacle to be specially present with them, to bless and protect them, and to give them access to him in prayer. And so the tabernacle, if you like, was a bit like the router that you use to connect your computer to the internet. The internet is not in your router. I don't understand any of this, I hasten to add, so this is a very loose illustration. The internet is not in your router, is it? But the internet is with you in your home through your router, which gives you access to it. And back in the Old Testament, the Lord wasn't in the tabernacle as if it contained him. We've got God in a box. But he was with his people through the tabernacle, giving them access to him. The only other background thing to say is that we don't know which of the sons of Korah wrote this or when, but verse 9 is a clue because it mentions the temple. So in this next picture, the next king after David was Solomon. So there's now an S in the white crown. That's King Solomon. And Solomon replaced the tabernacle with a permanent building, the temple, which is that kind of grander thing with a T in. So this psalm would have been written sometime after that. Don't know when. So let's get into it to look for what God is saying to us through it. And the first message of Psalm 48 is that the Lord should be praised as the only God there really is. It's a very un-PC psalm. In other words, it's saying what I said at that party. It's saying the God of the Bible is the only one who's really there, and all other beliefs about God are wrong. So look down to verse 1, which says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God." And the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, is the personal name that God gave himself in the Old Testament to distinguish him from all the other supposed gods that people believed in, like El and Baal and Marduk and all the others. So verse 1, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great King." So up on the screens again, there's the city of Jerusalem on Mount Zion, and in it is the temple where God made himself specially present. And so they called it the city of our God, of the great King being the Lord. Now, this translation says in verse 2, Mount Zion in the far north. But this, as you may know, was written in Hebrew. And literally that bit says, up on the screens, Mount Zion, the uppermost peak to Zaphon. So you can imagine the translators saying to themselves, they will never understand what that means. But we clever Old Testament scholars know that Mount Zaphon was a mountain up north, so we'll just put in the far north to sort of smooth that one over. And then you completely miss the point. If you stick with what it literally says, you get the very un-PC point. Literally, it says, Mount Zion is the uppermost peak compared to Zaphon. And if you look at the screens, all you need to know is that Mount Zaphon was where the Israelites' neighbors, believed their great god, El, lived. But verse 2 is denying his existence. It's saying, no, Mount Zion is the uppermost peak to Mount Zaphon, which was sort of Old Testament speak for saying our God is the real great king and yours isn't. So imagine the son of Korah who wrote this at a party, and this bloke says, "What do you do?" And he says, "I work for the temple." And the bloke says, "Are you some kind of counselor?" And he says, "No, my job is to tell people about God, about our God through song." And quick as a flash, this guy says, "But you're not saying that all the other gods that people believe in, El and Baal and Marduk, you're not saying they're all wrong, are you?" And this son of Korah says, "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. There's only one real God, and he deserves to be honored and praised by everyone on the planet. That's why I do what I do." And that's the point in verse 2 where he calls the Lord the joy of all the earth. That's what he should be. And it's the great tragedy that he's not. So that's the first bit of this psalm's message. The Lord should be praised as the only God there really is. And with all the upcoming opportunities to tell people about the Lord, from the big question events coming up through to Christmas, that's the only conviction that will keep us talking and inviting and praying to people who increasingly do not want to hear and are offended when we say, look, this is the truth. The conviction we need is that everyone around us owes the Lord the honour and praise of lives lived for him, because he gave us our lives in the first place. And not so that we would just say, thanks very much for the life, I'm just going to live it the way I want, but so that we'd say to him, thanks for everything. Now, how can I live for you in response? Needless to say, most people today, and perhaps some here who are just looking into this, would think that what I've just said is, what are the words that always come out? Arrogant, bigoted, intolerant. Because most people think that all religious beliefs are just personal, subjective opinions. That's how the world deals with them. So you have no right on that view to say that your beliefs are true and others are not. But the son of Korah who wrote this psalm would have said, excuse me, my beliefs are not personal, subjective opinions. They are based on real events in history through which I'm convinced God has made himself known. Let me tell you more. And so the second heading, which is a continuation of the first, is this. The Lord should be praised as the only God there really is. Second heading, because he's proved himself to be that in the experience of his people. So look on to verse 3. Within her citadels, so that's within Jerusalem's fortresses and defences, God has made himself known as a fortress. And 5 words there sum up the claim of the Bible. God has made himself known. So, I don't believe what I believe because I have loads of needs and I've invented God as a psychological crutch. That's one way the world tries to cope with my beliefs. I don't believe what I believe because I worked out rationally whether I think God exists and what he ought to be like. It's another way the world tries to cope with us. I believe what I believe because God has made himself known through the words and events recorded in the Bible, climaxing with his own Son stepping into this world in the person of Jesus. That's the claim of the Bible. But the son of Korah, who wrote this, lived way before Jesus. And so in this psalm, he gives just one of many events he could have chosen through which God had already made himself known back then. So read on verse 4. For, in other words, this is backing up what I'm saying. For behold, which is kind of old-fashioned word, isn't it? And in some ways you wish the translators had taken it out. But actually, a modern equivalent would be something like, look. You remember how Tony Blair, really irritatingly, he always used to say, look, in interviews. So say, look, this is what I want you to get. This is what behold means. It's a Tony Blair, look. For look, the kings assembled. They came on together. And as soon as they saw it being Jerusalem, they were astounded. They were in panic. They took to flight. Trembling took hold of them. Their anguish as of a woman in labor. By the east wind you shattered the ships of Tarshish. Better translation would be, you shattered them like ships of Tarshish, shattered by the east wind. So up on the screens is a picture of what that is on about. Jerusalem was under attack. That's verse 4. The kings assembled, they came on together. But weirdly, verse 5, as soon as they saw Jerusalem, they were astounded, they were in panic, they took to flight, and so on. In other words, they only get as far as seeing Jerusalem, and somehow the Lord defeats them. And not a shot is fired. There is one particular Old Testament event which fits that description like a glove. We can't be sure it's the one that this son of Korah had in mind, but it was either this one or one very like it. The event I'm thinking of happened in 701 BC during Isaiah's ministry. Hezekiah was king in Jerusalem, wearing the white crown, and the superpower of the day was Assyria. And the Assyrian emperor sent his commanders, who were also called kings, as in verse 4, to surround Jerusalem and attack it. So there they are in red. And they sent messages into Hezekiah saying, look, we've conquered all the other countries around here, and none of their supposed gods has done anything to stop us or to protect people. And you are kidding yourself if you think yours will. Your God is not real, Hezekiah, and so don't trust him to save you. So at that point, the Lord's honour is really on the line, because if he lets his city fall, then it's going to look as if he wasn't the great king after all, or even wasn't real at all. So here's what Isaiah chapter 37 says happened next. Let me read it to you. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, I will defend this city to save it for my own sake. My reputation is on the line, and for the sake of my servant David. And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians, and then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And if you're just looking into the Bible, you might think, yeah, tell me another one. We know from sources outside the Bible two things which tally with that. One is a secular historian who says that some disaster, maybe plague, hit the Assyrian army in the region and forced it to withdraw. The other is the official record of Sennacherib's own reign that admits that he tried and failed to take Jerusalem. So look on to verse 8. Son of Korah says, as we've heard, so have we seen. In the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, which God will establish forever. So maybe this son of Korah even lived through those events and wrote this in response. And he's saying, just as we heard from previous generations what the Lord has done, we have now seen with our own eyes more evidence that he's real. And as I said, the climax of all the Bible's evidence is when his son stepped into this world in the person of Jesus. So that's the message of the next bit of the psalm. The Lord should be praised as the only God there is because he's proved himself to be that. Verse 3, God has made himself known. So you may be, just looking into the Christian message, wondering whether the God that these other people believe in is real. In which case you need to check out the history. Check out what the Bible claims has happened. Above all, please check out what it says happened when Jesus was on this earth 2,000 years ago. You can find that in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you could begin to do that tonight by taking a free copy of one of the Gospels off the welcome desk, and or by coming back to hear more Sunday by Sunday, especially during these big question events, and or by joining our Christianity Explored course, where we just take a look at Mark's Gospel and you can ask anything you like. So this son of Korah was convinced that God had proved himself real in events, like when he saved them from Assyria. And in the rest of the psalm, he says that in response we should do two things. So next heading, he says, we should rejoice in the Lord's love and righteousness. Look on to verse 9. He says, we have thought on your steadfast love, O God, in the midst of your temple. As your name, O God, so your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Let Mount Zion be glad. Let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgment. So there's two things he really wants to sing about and that we spend a good deal of our time singing about in our corporate worship. His steadfast love and his righteousness. So he's been thinking over these events, like being saved from the Assyrians. He's been thinking, what do they tell us about God? And he's thinking, they don't just tell us that God is real, they tell us about his love and his righteousness. So look at verse 9 again. We thought on your steadfast love on the one hand. That translates the word that they used back then for married love, for covenant love, love which promises I will and sticks. And back in Moses' time, having saved the Israelites from Egypt, God had basically proposed marriage to them at Mount Sinai. He basically said, I will be your God. And just as I have saved you from the Egyptians by bringing judgment on them, I will continue to save you whenever you need it from future enemies by bringing judgment on them. And in response, Israel back then had said, well, we will be your people. We'll trust you and live your way, brackets, imperfectly. And forgiveness was available for that. And if you've made a promise, the right thing to do is to keep it. And that's what righteousness at the end of verse 10 is about. He prays to God, your right hand is filled with righteousness. So that's the other thing about the Lord, steadfast love and righteousness. And that means God's quality of always doing the right or just thing. In this case, keeping his promise to his people, saving them by bringing judgment on their enemies. But he didn't always save them from their enemies. That's the big Old Testament problem. So fast forward up here on the screens. Fast forward 100 years or so from when he saved them from Assyria, and you find the Lord let the new superpower Babylon invade Israel, destroy Jerusalem and the temple, and take many of them into exile. That was not because his love had failed. It was because most of his so-called people had abandoned trusting in him at all and aiming to live his way at all. So this time, his righteousness, his got to do the right thingness, demanded that he bring judgment on his own people's sin. But in his love, he never gave up on them. So next picture, he let them return and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple to symbolize that he was still with them and did still love them. But that just raised higher than ever in the Old Testament the question, how can a righteous God on the one hand be committed in love to sinners like us on the other? Because our sin calls for his judgment. That's the right thing to do. And his love can't just overlook our sin, because that's not the right thing to do. And next picture, living this side of Jesus' first coming, we know how God finally resolved that tension between his love and righteousness. It was at the cross, when his Son, who had no sin, took the judgment our sin deserves. So on the one hand, God can forgive us and love us, and on the other, he can say, justice has been done to my satisfaction on your sins. Now, of course, the son of Korah who wrote this didn't know that. And so he would say we have even more reason to rejoice in the Lord's love and righteousness, because we do. So last heading, the other response he calls for is that we should pass on our knowledge of the Lord to everyone. So look down to verse 12. This son of Korah was thinking of those times like when God saved them from the Assyrians or caused Jerusalem to be rebuilt after the exile. And at the time of writing, he knew that his fellow Jews could come and visit Jerusalem and see in the very fact that it was still standing the evidence that God was real and loving and righteousness. And so he says to them in their day, come on, walk about Zion, go round her, number her towers, consider well her ramparts, go through her citadels, that you may tell the next generation, perhaps your kids who are with you for the guided tour, that, look, this is God. This wouldn't be here anymore apart from him being real and loving and righteous. This is God, our God forever and ever. He'll guide us forever. Now, living this side of Jesus' first coming, Jerusalem and the temple have lost their significance, because what they were all about has now been fulfilled in Jesus. So if you ask, what's our ultimate evidence that God is real? How has he supremely made himself present with us and shown us his love and righteousness? The answer is in Jesus. In his incarnation, God with us. In his death to bring us access to God. In his resurrection so that he's alive and he can now be with us by his Spirit, and one day will take us home to be with him in that glorious city that we read about in Revelation 21. And son of Korah is saying we're not just to enjoy that knowledge ourselves, we should pass it on. Verse 13 says to the next generation, but living this side of Jesus' first coming, we know that that means not simply telling our kids about him, but being involved in the mission to tell everyone around us and worldwide. Which brings us back to where we began. Because if the Lord is the only God there really is, we need to pass that knowledge on to others who need it. So as a final illustration of that, let me tell you about the mountain that has been up there all the time. That is Mount Kenya. And here it is here she is in her daytime glory. Our partners in Buri in Kenya live just below the mountain. So on a good day, you look out of Mwendwa's window and you can see that a little bit further away. Mwendwa is the leader of the partnership at their end, and his grandfather was one of the first converts in that part of Africa to Christ. And previously, he had worshipped the God that they believed lived at the top of Mount Kenya, or Kirinyaga, as they call it. And Kirinyaga is the God. But just like Psalm 48 said, no, you find the real God through Mount Zion, not Mount Zaphon. The Christian missionaries came and said, you find the real God through Jesus, not at the top of that. And do you know what the average life expectancy of those early missionaries in Africa was from the time they arrived at Mombasa? 18 months. They died of everything going, and yet wave after wave after wave of replacement missionaries came and died. And Mwendwa told me his grandfather once said to him, we realize that their God must be real, because even though it cost them their lives, they just kept coming. And that's the spirit of Psalm 48. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, not just by us, because he's the joy of all the earth. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that we don't today have to root ourselves through a city, through a temple, to come to you. We thank you that your Son's death on the cross has opened a permanently forgiven way to come to you. We thank you that right now, by your Spirit, we are in your presence, and in his presence, the risen Lord Jesus. And we thank you that one day faith will give way to sight, and you will take us home to be with you there. And Father, that is a far more precious thing to us. We want you to be with us here, but we know that nothing will ultimately be solved in this fallen world until Jesus comes again, and everything is wrapped up and everything is recreated, and we are with you there. Father, we do say to ourselves, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. When we're here with brothers and sisters, when we're hearing this, we think, yes, we know it's true, and yet we will be cowards tomorrow morning. And we cry out to you for this season of evangelism coming up. Please fill us with your Spirit. Please make these convictions as strong in us when we're out there with others who don't believe them, who don't want to hear them. Help us to tell them and help them to believe. In Jesus' name, amen.